Members of the Kim dynasty have ruled it since day one, and they have provided political comedy for the world, but almost nothing for their subjects. Tim Marshall. There probably isn't a nation on Earth that arouses more morbid curiosity while simultaneously being a black box with limited information available to outsiders, as the isolated nation of North Korea is. Perhaps this mystery contributes to the outside world's fascination, a fascination that is fueled by the brutality and incompetence of the regime, as well as many ridiculous stories involving legends that they supposedly do not defecate. True story, there is an actual false story about Kim Jong-un not taking dumps. Anyway, unsurprisingly, North Korea is found on the Korean Peninsula, in Northeast Asia, bordering China to the north and South Korea to the south, but it also borders Russia on a tiny little sliver to the north as well. That's worth mentioning. It also borders the Yellow Sea to the west and the Sea of Japan to the east. Given its proximity to Siberia, it's a fairly cold country, and it's also very mountainous with numerous rivers and shorelines. To the south lies the DMZ or DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. A pretty stupid name given the fact that it's the most militarized area on the planet. A previous Korean state was known as the Hermit Kingdom due to its hostility to trade and international affairs. This term applies to North Korea today as well. The modern story of North Korea starts off with the Empire of Japan. See, Korea was under brutal occupation of the Japanese Empire, a legacy that still plagues relations between both Koreas and Japan to this day. During World War II, the Americans kicked the Japanese from the south, and the Soviets kicked the Japanese from the north. Both installed their own quasi-puppet dictators, but the one put in place by the Soviets was far worse. His name was Kim Il-sung. During the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, the North Koreans would invade the South, overwhelming their enemies for a brief period of time. In response, the US led UN forces to push back the North Koreans all the way to the line close to the Chinese border. Despite being called UN forces, the bulk of the foreign soldiers were American, along with some Brits, Canadians, and for some reason, the Turks. In response to this, Mao, the leader of the People's Republic of China, sent human waves of soldiers to defend the North. Violence stopped as two sides were stuck at the 38th parallel. American General MacArthur wanted to take on China, possibly using nukes, but President Truman dismissed him, and by and large the stalemate stayed intact. Keep in mind that technically the Korean War is still ongoing, given the fact that it didn't end with a peace treaty but rather a ceasefire. For a brief period of time, North Korea actually had a larger economy than South Korea, as crazy as it sounds. Nonetheless, South Korea democratized during the 1980s, invested into the production of high-quality exports like electronics and shipping, and eventually became one of the most technologically advanced, economically prosperous, and democratic nations in the world, while most North Koreans still lived in squalor. Massive military budgets, poor infrastructure, and a political system based off of extreme repression without the commerce to make up for it meant that North Korea was dependent on aid from the Soviet Union. That was until the Soviet Union collapsed, and after the USSR collapsed, North Korea tended to stick more with the People's Republic of China, as Russia had more important matters in Europe to attend to. Without the fertilizer from the Soviet Union, the nation could no longer feed its people. By the end of the Cold War, some tensions had calmed down, but at the end of the day, North Korea was still very hostile to South Korea and Japan. In 2006, North Korea revealed that it was able to produce nuclear weapons under Kim Jong-il's reign, leading to widespread sanctions. Kim Jong-il, despite being the god in the eyes of his people, was not immortal, and he was eventually dead, and replaced by his youngest son, Kim Jong-un. Since then, Kim Jong-un has consolidated power to promote democracy and freedom for all of his people. Oh, wait, sorry, I made a mistake in the script. He actually executed his uncle via an aircraft gun and assassinated one of his brothers, so that's fun. Moving on to the country's political system. North Korea is a system that makes Iran look like Norway. Their entire political system revolves around a personality cult surrounding the Kim family. The reverence for the family is on tier with that of a religious cult, despite being an atheistic state. The only power source in the country comes from the military generals, who, as far as we can tell, are deeply interlocked with the Kim family. However, our understanding of this dynamic is blurry at best. Speaking of generals, North Korea possesses one of the largest militaries in the world. As of 2025, it most likely has the fourth largest military. However, much of the equipment is outdated, and the soldiers are not as well trained as their enemies, and really not fed particularly well either. Much of their food supply comes from South Korea and the US, who give them food to shut up. And in the event of war, much of that food supply would probably disappear. Granted, North Korean soldiers would be pretty tough, given their harsh living standards, while the South Korean soldiers are used to playing video games, so I guess it evens it out. Their military is also heavily dependent on railways to transport military equipment, as it's more difficult for enemies to detect which trains contain missiles. The military also has hypersonic missiles, long-range cruise missiles, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. As crazy as it sounds, the possession of nuclear weapons is possibly the wisest action they ever partook in. Not under moral standards, but under the standards of self-preservation for the regime. Some details are up for debate, but North Korea is aware of the fate of nations that have given up their nuclear weapons programs to appease great powers. Libya gave up their nuclear weapons programs under Western pressure, only to be crushed by Western forces. Ukraine also got rid of their nuclear weapons to appease Russia, on the condition that Russia would respect their sovereignty. And to put all of this lightly, none of it worked. By sticking to their nukes, North Korea can preserve the Kim family by thwarting any attack by the US or its allies. If North Korea develops nukes that can target the mainland of the US, like say Seattle or Portland, then Americans are far less likely to defend South Korea or Japan under the event of an attack. This could wreak havoc on the US, Japan, South Korea alliance, as the US would not be able to aid those countries directly. This has led to the highly controversial proposal that South Korea and Japan might then develop their own nuclear weapons. Now, speaking of foreign affairs, Japan continues to have very poor relations with North Korea, due partly to Japanese war crimes in Korea during World War II, as well as its alliance with the United States. The Kim family views the US as enemy number one, despite their love of Hollywood movies and the NBA, and Japan is probably number two. Or maybe South Korea, they're all kind of hated in some giant mishmash. Anyway, the US has tried several strategies to deal with North Korea. Bill Clinton tried a diplomatic method and then failed. Bush was pretty aggressive, but that failed. Obama ignored them, and that also failed. And then Trump threatened them with annihilation and got a photo op with Kim Jong-un. So I guess that didn't really work either.
I came in and took a very hard position. Very hard position. And you know what? Now we have this great relationship, and let's see what happens. We're going to have another meeting. Chairman Kim would like to have another meeting. We'll have a meeting. I was really being tough, and so was he. And we would go back and forth, and then we fell in love. Okay? No, really. He wrote me beautiful letters, and they're great letters.
Unfortunately, this romance didn't really lead anywhere. Overall, there have been plenty of sanctions placed on North Korea. Initially, those targeted food and medicine have been terrible for the people of North Korea, but in recent years there's been a push for sanctions to target luxury goods that has really pissed off the ruling class, unsurprisingly. Far more so than sanctions against food and medicine. Overall, North Korea's friends are few in number. While the USSR was a core ally, successor state Russia had initially distanced itself from North Korea, letting China take the front seat. However, this has recently changed during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in which Russia bought much military equipment from North Korea and has been using North Korean soldiers as cannon fodder in the war. However, this seems to be more of a sign of desperation on Moscow's part, rather than the burgeoning of some massively successful relationship. China views North Korea as a buffer against South Korea, a US ally, even though they don't have much love for the clownery that goes on in North Korea. China is also concerned that the collapse of North Korea would lead to a massive refugee crisis. The Chinese know that any unification between the South and the North would be on the South's terms, as the South Koreans have a far larger economy, far more cultural influence, and far more diplomatic clout. While both Koreas share the same pre-World War II history and the same ethnic group, unification would be very different, far more so than Germany, as it would involve combining one of the most advanced nations with one of the most backwards. Now, speaking of backwardness and productivity, let's go to the economy. As far as the economy goes, it's very difficult to find Western products in North Korea unless you're a member of the elite. This makes it really hard to assess what exactly goes on in North Korea as far as the economy is concerned. We know that they have a fair bit of mineral wealth, but they also have a very low-skill workforce. Their budget, for all we know about it, can be summed up in two parts. One, a tremendous amount of money spent on luxury for the elite, and the other, for military spending, which takes out around a fifth of the entire economy. And keep in mind that in a centrally planned economy, the government budget is basically the economy. To make matters worse, their currency is pretty much useless abroad with no international exchange market. The government, after all, has an incentive to keep the people poor and uneducated, as countries with rising incomes tend to have populations that demand more rights. The only exceptions are oil-rich nations that can provide enough luxury for the populace to keep them subjugated. Recently, there's also been some allowances made for small-scale enterprises, including some banks, but overall the economy is still overwhelmingly centrally planned and agrarian. And most people, as far as we know, still probably work on farms. The government has even promoted rabbit farms to deal with starvation. Granted, rabbit meat is basically confiscated by the state. Nonetheless, some international chains have opened up, such as a few Singaporean fast food chains like Waffle Town USA, a fried chicken chain, and waffle fast food restaurant with an Asian twist. Perhaps that will be the gateway to opening up commerce with other nations, particularly less hostile nations like Singapore. Will this trend end North Korea's closed-off regime? Who knows? Maybe a small, very subtle trickle of freedom will move into the country, even if that freedom comes from a non-free country like China. China's authoritarian, but it's nowhere near as authoritarian. And maybe through those economic trade relationships, more and more people can be boosted out of poverty. Will that lead to a democracy, equal rights under the law, or removal of mass censorship? As far as I'm concerned, no. But maybe it will be something a little bit better than what we have now. Thanks for watching.